Hello everyone. I wanted to discuss group channels and why you'd want to use a group channel. But basically, at the start, what is a group channel? The way I think of it is, if say you've recorded a group of guitars like I have here. So here's my guitar. So guitar 1, guitar 2, guitar 3 and guitar 2 the wrong way around. But anyway, I can actually send all of those separate guitar tracks to one stereo fader towards the right hand side of my mixer at the end of my mixer, because historically a group channel would be based on a hardware mixer or mixers towards the right hand side of your mixing desk generally. Okay, so what you could do if you wanted to add an effect to all of them, obviously it's going to save you a lot less processor power than if I had to put the same effect on each one of these channels. If I wanted to use the same EQ effect, you could do it on one channel, but also it's really handy for levels. So generally you thought, hold on a minute, my guitars are a bit too loud. You can quickly and efficiently get to a mix, find your guitar group channel. We know this blue one here are group channels, and I'll show you how to set this up, and actually just control the fader there. There are other reasons why you should use group channels. People say that if they're using an EQ on different channels and say a kit or something, overheads or certain things like that, you can get phase issues. I haven't ever witnessed that myself. I haven't ever run into that problem, but I can certainly see why, if I had, say, a drum track and I wanted to put a slight bit of compression on there or some sort of an effect to glue it together, because of course digital recording nowadays, everything's so clinical and so separated in a way that if I record all these guitars, they're so on these individual channels, it's quite nice to have some sort of way of linking them up so it sounds like they're together. Now, one way could be if you had a reverb perhaps on a send on your group channel, or you perhaps used, as I'm doing here, just a slight bit of compression on your group channel, because therefore the same compressor is being used on all of them and the same settings of the compressor. So it's kind of it's making everything in the same family almost, I suppose. That's one way to think about it. And here I've got a bit of distortion, only tape tube distortion, but a bit of saturation, but it's on all of them and the same amount. So it is a great way of, so we know it's a good way of obviously mixing and changing levels quickly. If you want to use the same EQ settings or same reverb settings on everything, it's going to save processor power, but also it's going to glue your tracks up to some degree. People may argue that it's minimal what it does, but it does. If you use the same effect and using on all of them, it can't help but give all of the tracks some sort of familiarity between them, if I can say it. I don't know if that came out right. Okay, the other thing I wanted to say before I show you how to set these up, because at the moment I'm using some things that aren't related to Cubase, like these compressors here. I'm going to take these off and show you how to make a group channel just with what we've got, or maybe keep these but make another group channel. But in my groups, I've got, at the moment on this one, I don't know why I've called this track up, just it was one of the first ones on my recent things that I was looking at. You can see here I've made an effects send, and if you don't know how to make an effects channel, look at our earlier videos, because we did that, setting those up, and we've actually touched on making group channels. But here you can see clearly the group channels are the blue ones here. I've got my guitars, I've got bass, I've got vocals, I've got drums, I've percussion. The reason I can't quite remember why the percussion went on its own. I think because probably there's quite unusual percussion, and also I did a bit more heavier cut on the bass end on the percussion, which I wouldn't have done on the kick, because I want to keep this, it's quite dancey track. I want to keep a low sub kick in there. And synths I've made, and then I've got this thing called a mix bus. The reason I use a mix bus rather than put everything just on the master channel at the end. So what I do, I send all of my group channels that I've made, and you see here at the routing out, they're going to my mix bus. The reason I use a mix bus is so I can put what they call a glue compressor. This is based on an SSL compressor, but Cubase has got something very similar, which I'll show you. And basically this is not moving very much, but it's just putting a bit of gentle compression on everything, just again to make all of those groups and all of the single instruments sound more together. And it does work. It gives it a nice sound, because it sort of gives it a bit more of an analog sound. And this is based on an SSL compressor, I think, from one of the old massive mixing desks would have this built in, and it was, you know, loads of albums have been used with the SSL, and of course using this way of grouping everything together and putting it through just with a, you know, not particularly heavy compression, but what they call glue to push it through. The other reason is, quite often, I don't know if I have on this track, I haven't, but if I'm writing something in a similar style to a track I know that's been commercially released, I will in fact go File, Import, Audio File, and I'll actually import the audio file as a stereo file at the top here, and I use that as a reference. They call it reference monitoring. The reason you want to do that is because if you know that's a good mix and it plays on other people's systems and it's commercially available, and you know it sounds good, you can use it as a reference. So you can keep it muted, but keep soloing back to listen to it against your mix. So you can check your bass against theirs, check the treble, check for your mid-range, any sort of EQing, but just general the mix, how loud the guitars are, if you've used guitars, those sort of things. So I'd really recommend referencing against something that you like and you know is in a similar sort of vein to it. Now, the reason I mentioned importing a reference track is because if I had my EQ here, my Pultec, and my SSL compressor on the master send, if I had imported a reference track, that also goes through to my master channel. So every time I'd reference, I'd have to bypass my two effects here. But because, if you imagine, everything is going to my mix bus apart from the one reference track, which is just going to my stereo out, it has no effects on it. So it's exactly as the band or the artist or whatever wanted it to be, rather than coming through my effects as well. So I'm listening to it purely as the commercial mix as I bought it. So all of my mix is coming through here with my little bit of glue and a bit of EQing there. So I've put some high end on that one. But here, if I got a reference, it would come straight to my master, so I wouldn't be colouring the sound at all. So that's why I do that. I hope that makes sense. I'll probably do a demonstration on how I actually do that in reference tracks, because it really is quite important. I think it's a great way of mixing, and if you're mixing on headphones as well, it's a great way of referencing your mix against something else when you're working on something that could have, you know, if your headphones got a bit of extra bass or whatever, you'd hear that in a commercial mix as well, so you'd be able to control yours. And there's nothing stopping you putting 3 or 4 commercial mixes in there. It doesn't matter at all, as long as they're going to the stereo out, just solo them along. Okay, so enough about that. So I'm going to show you how to set up a mix bus. We know why we want a mix bus, so for all those reasons we said, but let's perhaps have a look at setting one up again, because I did describe this. If I just play this track really quickly, this is something I did for a company a while ago. Now, the vocals themselves, you know, I said about using sorry, let me just get around to it. Sorry. Okay, vocals on my bus. So, and if you can hear that as well, what I've done, I've actually put a sidechain. Now, this sidechain's not a part of Cubase, so we've looked at setting a sidechain up, so you could do that perhaps. The only reason I wanted a sidechain on everything is because I wanted it to have that kind of pumping effect, And rather than put it on every single channel, where I may have put it on a couple of other channels, I wanted it on all of the vocals to have that effect, so I've done that. And I've also put a bit of well, I've put tube compression, which is a bit more saturation on the higher end, and a bit of tape saturation on the lower end. What else have I done with this? I've also put an LA2A on the vocal part, just to compress the vocals a bit. Okay, so that side, that just demonstrates just one channel, why I would group them all together. And of course, the main reason, I can actually control the level on all of those as it goes. It's just stop. But okay, so what channels would I group? Obviously here, guitars I group together, bass guitar I group together, because I put a different kind of compressor on the bass. We'll look at those, but I don't want to get too bogged down with compression, because that can be a whole new video of its own. Okay, the Vox, so the vocals I've grouped together, drums are grouped together, percussion, synths, and they're all going to my mix bus, which is then going to the stereo out. So I'm going to show you how to, in the next couple of days, make a template, so a Cubase template that you can keep coming back to speed up your workflow. So if you want to start a new project, you can do that. But let's have a look how we can set up a group track. So let's do this with guitars, because we know we've got a guitar group, but let's make a new one. So I'm going to go Project, Add Track, and you see here it's a group channel. I'm going to call this now New Guitars, because we've already got a guitar one. Now, be really careful here. Your configuration, you're obviously going to want it stereo, because my guitars are panned left and right. I've got stereo effects on there. I don't want a mono channel. So generally on a group channel, you'd want a group to be a stereo track, because anything that you've done in any of these tracks which has got a stereo effect or a panning or anything just won't pick it up in a mono on a group. So we've got to make sure that's stereo. The routing, you see my output here is going to stereo out, but I want that to go to my mix bus, so I can do that. You can do this later. I'll show you how to do this as well. Okay, and you can make a folder track, but I'm not going to do that because I want to see it all as we go down, so don't worry about that at the moment. We'll discuss that as well. So I'm going to add that track, and what it's going to have done on my bottom of my mix here it is, so New Guitars. So when I press play now, you'll get absolutely nothing, because there's nothing routed to it at the moment. So at the moment it's behind my mix bus. Perhaps I'll just drag this up in Cubase. You can drag any track where you want it. So let's put it near the guitars. So my guitars are getting a signal on the group, but my new group's not. The reason being, if I go to a guitar track, you see my output in here is set to guitars. Now I could change that there to output it to my new guitars and would get a signal, but I want to do it to them all. So rather than go across to here and the outputs, which you can do of course, I'm going to go to F3, and here's my guitars here, and I can actually visually see all the guitar channels together. And there again, my routing, there's my outputs, so my inputs and outputs. So these are the outputs here. I'm going to send them to New Guitar. And that's a guitar as well. So now, fingers crossed, if I scroll to the right, oh, I've only got one channel at the moment, hold on, sorry. Ooh, let's find somewhere where they've got a few guitars coming in. Here you go. Okay. Now let's go across and have a look at this guitar. We know the groups are the blue. See, now we've got nothing happening in the old guitar track which we made, the group channel. They're all going through to that. So now I might want to think about putting a low cut, perhaps. So there's no reason, no reason to because it's guitar and I've got a lot of bass in this anyway, there's no reason to have anything down there. I might want to put a boost around 5k, and I can do that to all the guitars now because they're all routing to it. I may also want to put a compressor on this to group them together. Now these compressors and stuff are third-party compressors, so let's look at something in Cubase that I might want to put on there. So and compressor is under dynamics. I might want to put you've got a standard compressor, and there'll be settings for guitar there. If I put electric, oh, hold on, guitar then. So you've got a rough idea of where your clean rhythm picking, so I could put that on there, and then that would be that's showing you the gain reduction. I'll discuss compression in much more detail. We're going to go through all these. I might even want to put a de-esser on there. Now, de-esser is obviously used to take away S's or high sibilants out of vocals, but a lot of people will use these on perhaps hi-hats that are too bright. Anything that's particularly bright, it can, that can work as well. So, sorry, I've lost where I was. Okay, on the de-esser there. But other things, tube compressor is quite a nice one, and you might have here we got bus compressor, or have we got anything under guitars? Remember, the presets are really good. I was going to discuss how this works, but I'm not going to, because I'm going to discuss compression in much more detail. So you see what I'm doing though. I'm sending everything to here. I might even want to put reverb, and I'm sure I've got reverbs. I've got one reverb channel there, so I could put reverb on the send there, and then I'd probably be putting reverb on everything. Then all my guitars would have reverb on them. But I've used reverb on my individual tracks if I scrolled along, so I'm not going to worry about that at the moment. Okay, so that's group channels, and I hope you got an idea of why I would then use a mix bus, or what they would call a mix bus. I've seen engineers as well and producers use 2 mix buses for adding even more, so you can be more subtle with each effects and stuff. And I also want to discuss with you making New York compression, or a parallel compression and parallel distortion, which works the same way as I'm going to send certain instruments to a channel, which will then go to my mix bus in the end, but I can control the amount using a send to go to it, so I can have a really heavily distorted channel that I can send things like perhaps a snare or perhaps a vocal to, but only a smidgen of it, just to give it a bit of distortion or a bit more life to it, really. Harmonics. Okay, so that is grouping. And one thing I didn't do with this, I did. Sorry, I did that when I set it up. But if I hadn't have done that when I made it, remember everything, if you don't specify where it goes to, it will go to your stereo out straight away. But if you made all of these groups and you're sending them to the mix bus like I have, so if you make a mix bus, don't forget your output here, your routing on that group channel would have to go to the mix bus as well. If you have something that goes straight to your main outs, it makes mixing quite difficult because of volume issues and things like that. So if you have made a mix bus and you've got your groups, it's worth probably putting all your groups in there. Again, there's no hard and fast rule with this, that this is definitely what you have to do. It's just how I would go about doing things. But they seem complicated at first, mix buses, but it really does simplify things in the end. And if you imagine, like, we're going to look at making templates, we're going to make a template with mix buses in place, it's going to speed up your workflow no end, and it really does add continuity between different tracks. It gives all of those guitars some sort of uniform effects and stuff, so it's really handy. It definitely is really handy. One thing I forgot to mention as well, automation, volume automations. You can automate all of the guitars, or be it whatever, the drums, whatever you want to do, and you can ride them all. And that is another video I'm going to do over the next few days as well, which is looking at using my mix bus automation on my mix bus to add more punch in my choruses and stuff. Something I do to make my mixes more dynamic, so they're not all the same level. And that's I found a useful trick as well. But experiment with group channels. They're good fun. Okay, good luck.